don't get a mullet unless you're happy to look like a twat for a while. I've got these little Prince Charming. It's growing and I'm happy about it. It's just not growing fast enough. Hi, I'm here with some very specific book recommendations today. This is a tag by Steph Bora. I will tag her in the description. And I love me a tag. I love me a book tag. So I'm doing one today. The first prompt is a book that you tell people is your favourite. Now, my go-to was always to tell people that my favourite book was The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I have since reread The Name of the Wind and taken into consideration some other criticisms I've heard on other channels, and I don't think I can class this as my favourite book any longer. I still enjoy it a lot, but I have since read more books that I love more, essentially. I think at the moment I am more likely to tell people that my favourite book is either Bloody Rose by Nicholas Eames or Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. Both of those because they fall into the sort of irreverent fantasy category that I like a lot. Their women are written well, the world building is well thought out. Bloody Rose is very sort of D&D based. I read it when I was in my sort of D&D era and I have a lot of nostalgia about it for that reason. And then Nettle and Bone just sort of blew me away when I read it. I remember sort of screeching at my partner when I was reading it because I enjoyed it so much. And I don't usually do that about books, so it's always a good sign. And that, again, is a T. Kingfisher fairy tale retelling, kind of, ish. And I loved it because it had old hags and animal familiars and princesses doing what they shouldn't do and goblin markets and, you know, all that jazz, which is delightful and I love it. Second prompt, a book that is my guilty pleasure. I was going to say I don't believe in guilty pleasures when it comes to reading, and then I remembered I'm reading the Shadowhunters series, so I think that's going to have to be it because I am a little bit ashamed that I'm reading that. I think it's guilty in the sense that there are a lot of very valid criticisms about this series and Cassandra Clare herself, the author, but because it is such a nostalgia factor for me, I can't stop reading it. I say I can't stop. I still actively want to read it. And I have all the books and I'm working my way through them. So I think that's my guilty pleasure. A book that I loved, but everyone else. No. A book that everyone loved, but I didn't. Big one that I read recently was Babel by R.F. Kuang. I hated this. I thought the aspects about language and writing and etymology were really, really interesting because that is a thing I used to be really into. I can speak I used to be able to speak like 3 languages. So languages are a thing that I am very interested in. However, it was the most pretentious story I have read in a very long time. It did not need to be that long. None of the characters had any backbone. And I felt like they weren't making realistic decisions. It was a vehicle for a very important message and discussion on colonialism and things like that, which was, yeah, that's important. I agree that's important. I just thought the book was terrible. The actual plot part, the themes and the messages were fine. Just the actual vehicle for them was just unbearable. So that's top of that list. Also Killers of a Certain Age, but I have now heard some other criticisms. I've heard more people say that they disliked it and were disappointed by it, so I'm not sure that counts quite as much as Babel does. But yeah, Babel's the big one. No thank you, don't like it. A book I read the fastest. Now I read books quite fast anyway, so this one was quite hard to pin down. I wrote down House of Salt and Sorrows because I remember reading this one in one sitting and I remember enjoying it a lot, and it's one that I would recommend highly if you like sort of seaside haunted house horror. It took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting to like it as much as I did, but it was very, very good, so I would highly recommend this. You don't have to read it in one sitting. That was just my choice. A book that deserves more hype. The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter It's a really, really good book, and it's a genre of fantasy that I really like and I don't read enough of. I'm currently reading the Memoirs of Lady Trent, which also falls into this sort of Victorian women do their own independent thing with a touch of fantasy on the side. And it's very, very good. Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter is about all the women from all those famous Victorian stories sort of era. So Jekyll and Hyde, Story of Dr. Moreau, Frankenstein, sure I'm missing some more. Like Dracula. All the women from those stories are drawn into the plot in suspenseful and interesting ways, and I highly recommend it. There are 3 books in the series, and all of them are as good as each other. A book that's becoming a movie or a TV show. I had to look this one up because I don't necessarily fall into the right spaces where these things are announced. But Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse is being adapted, which is quite exciting. I really enjoyed the first book in this series. I didn't love the second one, which is fine. Maybe I'll enjoy it in a TV or movie form. I don't think it said which format it was. But yeah, Black Sun is being adapted, and that's quite exciting because I think it should be. Black Sun is an epic fantasy about sun gods and crow gods and overthrowing old dynasties to replace them with new ones. And there are mermaid people and crow people, and you can ride dragons and big crows, and it's a hugely, hugely diverse book as well, which is super great, and we love to see that. A book that I've reread the most, I never really reread books, so this was an easy one to answer. Sorcerer of Thorns. I can't remember the last book I reread apart from this one. So Sorcery of Thorns. It is good. I will continue to reread this every couple of years. It's 100% a cosy comfort read, and I highly, highly recommend it if you like magical libraries and sentient books and demons and sword fighting and all that kind of jazz. It's very, very good. A book from a genre I don't typically read. The genre in question would be sci-fi, because I don't typically read sci-fi. I've started stretching out a little bit into those circles, but Binti is a novella that I listened to the audiobook on Scribd, and it's very, very good. And I enjoyed it a lot, despite it being sci-fi. So yeah, I would recommend that. That's a good one. A book that deserves all the hype it gets. The only one that I could think that kind of touched on this prompt correctly was Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. And I don't know if it's just hyped in my circles, because I haven't heard a lot of hype for this book, but I have heard some hype for this book. And it deserves every bit of it. It's a fantastic book. It was a 5-star read. It's set in Eastern Europe, adjacent fantasy version of Eastern Europe, and is all about fairy tales and the laws of fairy tales and how these 3 women get tangled up and unpick themselves from the tangles of fairy tales. It's so cleverly written, so cleverly written, and I love it a lot. A book I would usually recommend when asked to give a recommendation. Obviously that depends on the person who's asking. I think at the moment I'd recommend anything by T. Kingfisher to anyone, but Nettle and Bone would probably be my go-to book if I had to pick one. Obviously it depends from person to person, and I'm not going to do a whole range of like examples there. But yeah, I think anything by T. Kingfisher, any of my 5-star reads really, I'd probably go back on my core pile spreadsheet and just sort of pick all my 5 stars. A book that has my favourite characters. I had to have a little think about this one because I'm really bad for forgetting the characters as soon as I finish reading the book. But I think Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett has a very good cast of characters. I enjoy it a lot. There's a real found family vibe there. Now, I can't remember their names because I don't remember names after I finish reading books. But Sancha and her love interest and the old professor is a dynamic I really enjoy. It's like that grumpy sunshine thing. Big fan of that. A book I wish I could live in. This took me a second because not all the worlds I read about are great worlds to live in, but I think A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by T. Kingfisher would be a very good world to live in. I would like to live in a world where there are carnivorous sentient sourdough starters and sentient gingerbread men who will do dances for you. Yeah, like, I don't think I need to explain that. That is the world I would like to live in. A book I thought I would hate but ended up loving, A Dark and Hollow Star by Ashley Shuttleworth. I think I've talked about this book loads this year. I just thought I was going to hate it. It was on my TBR for 3 years, on my shelf, like my physical bookshelf, for 3 years before I picked it up. And I loved it. It was so good. It was not what I thought it was going to be. It was well written. It was diverse. It was funny. It was hugely entertaining. It was full of tension. And the sequel was just as good. So that, yeah, 100%, that fulfills that prompt. A book that made me cry was Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. This one was just so powerful and so full of feminine rage that by the end I was trying to like bottle it all up, and it just got too much and all the emotion had to come out of somewhere, so it came out of my face. And then a book I wish I could read for the first time again would be Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. I have reread this book since I read it the first time, but it didn't quite capture the same magic. I remember I spent an entire year, I think this was when I was starting to get back into reading, I spent an entire year reading everything Robin Hobb had ever published. And Assassin's Apprentice was the one that started it off, and I wish I could read it again because it was just so good. And I think for me it was refreshing as well to have a woman writing such well fleshed out epic fantasy, because up until that point that was not something I had seen or experienced. So that was important to me. Yeah, those were some very specific book recommendations. Again, I've tagged the original creator in the description below. Let me know if you've read any of these, and have a nice day.